I direct our foreign policy and national security programs at New America Foundation, and I'm very honored and happy today to present someone I consider an old friend, and certainly someone who from afar has been a bit of an intellectual mentor of my own in trying to think through the questions of what's happening to American power and sort of the currents of global affairs. And I think that Kishore Mahbubani, whom I met, I think it was in 1996, he doesn't recall this, but I may have met him before when I was at the Nixon Center, but when I worked for Senator Jeff Bingham, and I was just reminding him that we were in Singapore and hosted at a lunch by the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Singapore, or Embassy of the United States in Singapore, and Tommy Koh, another great agile intellectual, and Kishore Mahbubani, another person whose name I can't quite remember, and then Ambassador Nathan, who later became President Nathan, were there. And we were sort of irrelevant to that discussion, much like I think Kishore is going to talk about the irrelevance of America today. But they had a raging fight amongst themselves, or an argument, I should call it. It did seem like a fight. And it was one of the great moments when I realized how fun the life of a public intellectual and a policy wonk could be. I wanted to be Kishore Mahbubani, and I've developed some. If you've seen me at my toughest, some of you, I'm inspired by him. I hope some of you get a chance. We've arranged for Politics and Prose to have this book out there today. I'm midway through it. The New Asian Hemisphere: The Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East. It is a mesmerizing book, I think a very important book, and I cheated and read a little bit of the end as well. I always do that. And also read his recent piece in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Case Against the West. One of the people he thanks in the book, and who I think plays at least some part of a role, and sort of, I may ask Kishore to reflect on it, is Strobe Talbott, you know, our good friend who's president of the Brookings Institution. And I'll share a little anecdote because I think Strobe represents both part of the positive side of sort of inquiry and part of the negative side, in my view, of the blind spots in American foreign policy thinking. And I haven't really tried this out on anyone, so it could fail. But to some degree, a few years ago, Strobe wrote a piece when he was still Deputy Secretary of State on looking at the explosion of self-identity and determination, self-determination movements, self-identity movements around the world, and how states were breaking up. And wrote a piece that basically said we need to tread carefully, we need to deal with what we see coming and whatnot. And he was talking about the failure and collapse of the Soviet Empire and how the component pieces of that were struggling with this. And I asked him what he thought about the collapsing parts of the American empire, because to some degree the United States had organized itself in response to a Soviet challenge. Whether we said that overtly or not, it certainly was true. Japan was a great vassal to some degree and a satellite of American interest in Asia. Germany was the same in Europe. And so one had to sort of think through how the cost-benefit relationships in those relationships were going to change after the Soviet Union disappeared. And I'll never forget, and I said, you know, if you were in the CIA or thinking ahead about blind spots and terrorism, this is all before 9/11, remember. I said, if I was looking for terrorists or unstable regions, and I say this to my friend Mike Miyazawa here, I said I look somewhere like Okinawa, where you saw massive protests against American bases, and you saw a people that had 39 U.S. military installations on a small island, the poorest prefecture in Japan. As being a former Department of Defense dependent, it was easy for me to imagine, you know, DOD dependents getting kidnapped, or Molotov cocktails, or the organization of some kind of protest. And Strobe's response to me, wow, he says, I had no idea that the Okinawans had a separate history or language or anything. He said, secondly, you know, U.S. bases are anchors of stability in unstable regions. And this began to really bother me, this notion that American bases were anchors of stability in unstable regions, because it was a self-reinforcing view of the world that wherever we are, nonetheless promotes a kind of a determined stability. But what wasn't part of it was the reverse, as to what degree those anchors of stability or those bases could be triggers of instability, and frankly how, particularly if you weren't achieving your objectives in the world, how they could remind other states of your inability to achieve objectives. And to some degree, I think there's a loss of equilibrium in the world around these. And I'll just read very quickly the last paragraph, not to buy the book anyway. But it's a really cool. He says, at the beginning of the 21st century, as we enter into one of the most intense periods of change experienced by humanity, America is abandoning its pragmatist streak when it needs it most. We're moving into very uncertain political and economic terrains. It would be foolish to assume that the Western ideological assumptions of the 19th and 20th century will necessarily work in the 21st century. It would be wiser to keep an open mind and to challenge every ideological assumption embedded in our minds. Pragmatism is the best guiding spirit we can have as we venture into the new century. It is therefore only appropriate to quote once again the greatest pragmatist of the 20th century, Deng Xiaoping, "It does not matter whether a cat is black or white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat." But that kind of response is what I wish I'd had on hand for Strobe Talbot at that point when we were discussing this, because I do think that America has some blind spots, both ideologically and just simply from inertia in terms of thinking how the world is put together. Kishore Mahbubani, of course, was Singapore's former ambassador to the United Nations, a great diplomat. He's considered among polite admirers of his as part of Lee Kuan Yew's Gang of Four, of people who really were among the few people who could tell Lee Kuan Yew what they really thought at tough times in tough ways. He is now the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and I'm a tremendous admirer, and I look forward to wrestling with him, with all of you, after his interesting presentation. Please welcome Kishore Mahbubani.
You know, that kind of generous introduction is very dangerous. You know. Exactly. I think you raised the expectations of the crowd way too high. So my job is to now lower the expectations. I'll respond to the point on Strobe later in the course of my comments. In fact, I just came from a meeting with Strobe, by the way. I spoke at the Brookings at lunch today. And it's an American tradition to begin with a joke. It's an Asian tradition to begin with an apology. So I always combine both traditions, and I apologize for my bad joke. But the bad joke actually is a true story. When I was the permanent secretary of the foreign ministry in Singapore, the CEO position, one of my colleagues in another ministry, a permanent secretary, went to China and called on his counterpart in China, who was a vice minister. So when he arrived in the vice minister's office, he introduced himself. He said, "I'm Mr. Tan. I'm the permanent secretary of this ministry in Singapore." And there was a young Chinese lady translator. She looked very puzzled. She sort of scratched her head for a while. And then she said in Chinese, she said, "Well, this is Mr. Tan. He says he's the eternal typist of Singapore." So permanent secretary became eternal typist. The reason I begin with that story is that if you can have cross-cultural misunderstanding between Singapore, which is 75% Chinese, and China, which is 100% Chinese, we realize that developing cross-cultural understanding is a huge challenge, and that, in a sense, is the mission of my book, because we are entering a completely new era of world history, completely different from what we've experienced in the last 200 years. And how would I characterize this new era of world history? Well, I make two big points about the era. The first is, of course, it's the end of the era of Western domination of world history, but I hasten to add that the end of the era of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West will remain the single strongest civilization for 100 years or more. So it's not the end of the West, but it's the end of the era of Western domination of world history. And then to balance that, of course, you have not the rise of Asia, but the return of Asia. And the reason why I call it the return of Asia is because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were consistently China and India. And only in the last 200 years, first Europe took off, and then America came along. But before that, it had always been, in a sense, Asian countries, economies were the biggest. So what we're going to see basically is a return to the norm in the next in this century. And you've seen evidence of this already in the famous Goldman Sachs BRICS studies, which show that by the year 2050, the 4 largest economies will be, in the latest version, by the way, say that the 4 largest economies will be number 1, China, number 2, India, number 3, United States, number 4, Japan. Now, while most people have sort of absorbed the fact that the Asian economies are going to rise, I think what most of us, including myself, have not understood is how fast these changes are going to happen. And in fact, the person who really brought this home to me was Larry Summers. Because when I sent my book to him to get a blurb from him, and he gave me a wonderful blurb, Larry did. He also gave me a wonderful statistic, which I then put into the book, you know. And he basically said that if you want to understand Asia's rise, look at it this way. When the West had its industrial revolution, and you saw a significant improvement in the standard of living of people, what you saw was a significant improvement in the standard of living of about 50% in one lifetime. And that was a significant improvement. But he says when you look at Asia, where you're having something similar to the Western Industrial Revolution, what you're going to experience in one lifetime is an improvement not of 50%, not 100%, not 200%, but 10,000% in one lifetime. And that's an amazing statistic. And believe me, I was, of course, skeptical, you know. I said, this can't be true, you know. But fortunately for me, I was on a panel with Jim Wolfenson, the former president of World Bank, a few weeks later. So I said, Jim, you know, I've just got this incredible statistic from Larry Summers saying that Asians are going to experience 10,000% improvement in their standard of living in one lifetime. Is this credible? He says, yes, Kishore. I was also skeptical, but I asked my research assistants, they checked, and they found that the figure is correct. So if this figure is correct, it's a perfect illustration of how fast and how quickly these changes are going to come in the world. And frankly, most of us are not ready for these changes. Now, the question is, what will be the impact of these changes? And here I have essentially what I propose to share with you is what I call the good news, the bad news, and then hopefully some solutions to the bad news. And that's how I'll structure my remarks. So what's the good news? And I would make 3 points in my remarks about the good news. The first piece of good news, it's an important one, is that, you know, whenever you see Western leaders speak about the world, inevitably, you just look at their speeches, somewhere in the speech, there'll be a line saying, "We live in a dangerous world." And the world is becoming ever more dangerous, you know. And I have quotes in the book from George W. Bush, the French foreign minister, the Canadian ambassador. This seems to be so much a part of the Western mindset that, you know, we're entering a dangerous world. Well, the really good piece of news I have for all of you is that we are not moving into a more dangerous world. We are moving into a much safer world than anything we've experienced. And the reason, quite simply, is that the number of, you know, Bob Zoellick used a phrase called responsible stakeholder, say that China should become a responsible stakeholder. The number of responsible stakeholders in the world is growing by leaps and bounds. Hundreds of millions of people are going to join the middle classes. And guess what? Middle class people don't want to become suicide bombers. Middle class people want precisely the kind of stability and order and predictability that we all want. So that in a sense, the forces working in support of a more stable and predictable world order has never been greater. So it is not a more dangerous world. The second piece of good news is that if you want to understand why the Asian states are succeeding now, and as you know, some of you may know, I wrote a book called Can Asians Think? I wrote it about 10 years ago. And the reason why I wrote that book, quite simply, I tell my Asian friends, you guys were so smart, right? In the year 1000, Asia was here, Europe was here, America hadn't been discovered. In the year 2000, America is here, Europe is here, Asia is here. What happened, you guys? Why did you lose it? Right? And essentially, what happened is that the Asians have finally figured out what they need to do to succeed. In fact, most Asian societies now more or less know we have to implement some policies. And what I talk about in my book is what I call the 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And I emphasize the pillars of Western wisdom because since they're implementing Western best practices in order to succeed, right, they're not going to go and have a clash of civilizations with the West. In a sense, what they want to do is to see more of Western practices in their society. And let me just give you 1 or 2 illustrations of what I mean by Western best practices. The easiest one, the one to mention is, of course, is free market economics. And here you can see the impact of free market economics most dramatically in the case of China. You know, I went to China for the first time in my life in 1980, where it was still reasonably Maoist. And I remember going for a haircut in a barber shop, you know. So I went for a haircut, I had a wonderful haircut. The barber took a lot of time, took 1 hour, cut my hair very slowly, did a great job. So when I finished, I said, thank you very much. I said, well, why do you take so long to do a haircut? He says, it doesn't matter. If I do 5 haircuts, 10 haircuts, 20 haircuts, I get paid the same. So what's the hurry? So, you know, you had an iron rice bowl. So with an iron rice bowl, no one worked in China. But the minute China switched and went from the centrally planned economy to free market economics, China today, you've seen the fastest growing economy in China over the last 30 years. And watching the most populous country in the world having the fastest growing economy is as unnatural a sight as seeing the fattest boy in a class win the 100-meter race, right? That's not supposed to happen. And the most populous state is not supposed to have the fastest growing economy, but it has. And one fundamental reason, of course, is free market economics. And the Chinese today believe in it more strongly than anybody else. I mean, there are other, what I call Western best practices, pillars of Western wisdom that I implement, the mastery of science and technology and so on and so forth. But the good news here again is that if they want to implement these Western best practices, they have a vested interest, right? I mean, if you want to have a strong free market economy, you need a global stability for it to succeed. If you need to export more of your products, you need global stability for that to happen. So all the new rising economic powers have a powerful vested interest in greater global stability. And the third piece of good news, which I think is maybe in some ways the best piece of good news, is what I call the march to modernity, which began initially, frankly, in Japan. From Japan went to the Four Tigers, from Four Tigers to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia to China, from China to India, is about to enter the Islamic world also. And this, for me, is a really good piece of news, because when I travel in the Gulf region, or if I go to Saudi Arabia and all that, I see that what they're looking for is a model for the future. They say, this is what we want. And what's significant about this is that in the past, you know, if you have, in a sense, a choice for many of these Islamic societies, they had on the one extreme the Osama bin Laden vision, which most of them rejected. And then you had the vision of trying to copy Western societies. And many of them didn't want to copy Western societies. So now the rise of China and India and the other Asian societies has finally provided them a model where you can grow fast economically and keep your cultural identity. You don't lose it. And so the modernization of China and India is going to have a tremendously positive impact on the Islamic world also. So you can see that there's a lot of good news coming from the rise of Asia. But of course, it is not just good news that comes. There's also bad news that comes. So what's the bad news? And here the bad news is something that I try to put across very delicately, because I know some of it can be quite painful. In fact, as I explained in the introduction to my book, many of my Western friends will find it difficult to read my book. It's an uncomfortable book to read. In fact, my wife told me not to publish it. Said, Kishore, you're going to lose many of your friends after you publish this book. But at the same time, if you're entering a new era of world history, you cannot just do it comfortably on the basis of your old mindset. You've got to change your mindset. You've got to get out of your established conventional patterns of thinking. And that's what the book tries to do. And the reason why I had to, in a sense, write these things very painfully is because I have a few unpalatable things to say to a Western audience, you know. Let me give you one example of one piece of bad news. Now, the first piece of bad news is that the West has traditionally assumed, whenever it looks at problems out there in the world, it assumes that the West is there always providing the solutions and the rest of the world is creating the problems. The solutions are in the West, the problems are out there. Well, today, even today, the West still remains the source of many solutions to world problems. That's still a reality. But increasingly, the West is becoming a large part of the problem. And the reason why the West is becoming a large part of the problem is because you have occupied so much political and economic space in the world that you've accumulated over 200 years. And the rest of the world was passive and accepted it. Now the West has got to learn to share power, has got to learn to cede positions of dominance it has in many organizations, and that's not going to be easy. People who occupied privileged positions never give up power easily, whether it's an individual position or a regional position or national position. You just don't give up power easily. And if you want simple examples, I mean, I'll give you some easy ones. I mean, take, for example, look at Washington, D.C., where you have the two most powerful international economic organizations in the world, the IMF and the World Bank. Till today, you have a rule that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And guess what? 3.5 billion Asians don't qualify to run the IMF or the World Bank, even though they have the world's fastest growing economies, they have the world's largest pool of foreign reserves, trillions of dollars, and they're now producing more economics PhDs than the West does. But we're not qualified to run the IMF or the World Bank. Now, you might think it's an easy thing to fix, but this, as recently as 2007, barely a year ago, you changed both the heads of the IMF and the World Bank. And guess what? Not one Western leader stood up and said the obvious thing. Hey, times have changed. We can no longer dominate these organizations. It is time we learn to share the management of the world with the rest of the world. Instead, there was another obscene rush to keep the positions to themselves. And that's dangerous. Because if you continue to hog on to positions that you accumulated in the past, when you had a much greater share of global GNP, global power, and you insist on keeping them, then the West becomes the problem. I mean, another example, obvious one, the UN Security Council, which is the world's most powerful, I guess, international political organization. You have 5 permanent members. And by the way, I believe that the idea of a veto and permanent membership is a good one. I'm not saying it's bad, because I think it's important to give the great powers of the day a stake in remaining in the United Nations, so that the United Nations doesn't die and go the way of the League of Nations, where the United States walked away. So the veto is a functional thing. But I think what the Founding Fathers had in mind was that you're supposed to entrench the great powers of the day and not the great powers of yesterday in the UN Security Council. And today, the only qualification to become the permanent member of the UN Security Council is that you must have won World War II in 1945. And even though you're going to have very soon I mean, the Europeans have announced it. Come January 2009, there'll be a common European foreign policy, finally a common one phone number to call in Europe for Henry Kissinger to find out what's European foreign policy. Great leap forward. Then the logical solution is, let's have a common European seat in the Security Council. Why do you need a British seat and a French seat, right? It's an obvious anachronism. But try to persuade London or Paris. Just go down there and say, come on, guys, be reasonable. Your time has passed. Let's move on. And you think they'll agree? I mean, it is things as simple as this that illustrate how the West is increasingly becoming a large part of the problem. And I can apply this to many other situations. I was in London with Sir Howard Davis, the director of London School of Economics, and he said you have something called the Basel Committee. It has got 13 members. Out of the 13, 10 are European. It excludes China, includes Luxembourg. I mean, what's going on here, right? What kind of world order is this? How do you have a world order based on this sort of thing? So I can go after organization after organization. So increasingly, unless the West realizes that it is becoming the force that is blocking change, right? We're not going to move ahead. But the second piece of bad news, and this is the hardest part for me to say, is that the West, in a sense, many people in the West accepted many people in the rest of the world accepted Western domination of the world because it was seen to be, in many ways, still relatively competently run. In fact, West provided the models of competence for the world. Now, if you go back to my earlier point about how the rest of the world is emulating Western best practices, that's an example of competence. And by the way, I have to emphasize that domestically, Western societies are still the most competently run societies in the world. Still, I mean, for all your problems in the United States or in Europe, these are the models for the rest of the world to copy and to follow. So domestic competence is still, the West is far ahead. But what's surprising is that these states which are being run competently domestically are now performing incompetently on various international and global issues. And that's what basically the article in the magazine Foreign Affairs is all about. I give 4 examples of incompetence. I'll touch on a couple of them here. The first one, the most obvious one, of course, if you look at the relations within the West and the Islamic world. I mean, I believe there's no necessary reason why you should have tensions between the West and the Islamic world. There is no fundamental clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. But there are specific Western policies that have generated anger in the Islamic world. So policies can be fixed. And that's the good news. But the bad news is that many of these policies are not easy to fix. I mean, if you look at the obvious examples of incompetence, the one that is you can mention is number one. If you look at the Middle East peace process, it's been going on now for I don't know how long. But as long as the Israel-Palestine issue continues, you're going to have huge problems within the West and Islam. And the tragedy here is that we now have an opportunity where we can actually make peace in the Middle East. I mean, for the Arab states, I think have more or less come to the conclusion that they are equally worried about Iran. In some ways, Iran is a bigger problem for many of them than Israel is. And so many of them say, okay, why don't we come to terms with Israel so we don't have to handle two at the same time? And they're actually putting pressure to bring about a two-state solution. And I believe it is in Israel's interest also to have a two-state solution. No country can go on occupying foreign territory forever. And I always tell my Israeli friends, if I see you walking towards a cliff, do I say stop or do I say proceed? And I say stop. Don't carry on this occupation forever. Now, if you had competence in the West in geopolitical management, we will be moving towards a two-state solution, seizing this opportunity and taking advantage of it. But instead, of course, we're not seeing it. And there is a remarkable degree of incompetence on this issue. And then the other issue, if you want a textbook example of incompetence, if you want to write a textbook on how not to invade and occupy a country, just study what the United States did in Iraq. I mean, it's astounding, the blunders after blunders after blunders that went into this occupation. It's amazing. I mean, what is astonishing, as I say in the book, is that there were actually people, I mean, I would say Ivy League trained people, intelligent people, thoughtful people in Washington, D.C., who actually believed that in the 21st century, an army of Christian soldiers walking onto Islamic soil would be greeted with flower petals. Who believed that? What kind of mindset did you, how could you even believe that? How could you not realize that times have changed? No country today would welcome a foreign army on its soil. It's as simple as that. And if you understand how much history has changed, just look back 100 years ago, right? My ancestors, 300 million of them could be ruled relatively passively by 100,000 Englishmen. Stunning. I still don't understand why my ancestors accepted it, but they did. 300 million of them. Today, the world's most powerful country, which spends more on defense than the rest of the world combined almost, cannot pacify one state of 25 million people with 160,000 soldiers. History has changed. We have moved on. But the mindset that believes that you can go around occupying countries still lives on. And that's an example of incompetence that's got to be changed. Now, I can give, briefly touch on other examples. You have all this talk about global warming that is going on. The global warming, as you know, is the flavor of the month. We're all supposed to be worrying about the snow caps melting in the Arctic and Antarctic, and I buy all that, okay? And I agree that global warming is a danger. But the paradox here is that it is the Western voices, including American voices, that have done so much to educate the world on the dangers of global warming, and yet the West remains the single biggest obstacle to a solution on global warming. And why do I say the West remains the single biggest obstacle to a solution on global warming? Because the global warming today is not a result of the new flows of greenhouse gas emissions that come from China or India or elsewhere. It's also a result of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that have been put up there by the West for the last 100 or 200 years or so. Now, if you want to make the Chinese and the Indians pay an economic price for the new flows of greenhouse gas emissions, and the good news, by the way, is that the Chinese and Indian policymakers now have come to accept, yes, okay, we have to pay an economic price for these new flows of greenhouse gas emissions. But they're not going to pay a price for the new flows if the West is not going to pay a price for the stock. They say, excuse me, you mean to say you get a free ride for all the stuff you put up there for the last 200 years? No thanks. No deal. So unless you can get the Western countries to accept responsibility for the stock of greenhouse gas emissions, you're not going to get a solution of any kind on global warming. And you know, only recently 2 Indian ministers came to launch their books at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and Chidambaram and Kamal Nath, and they were very clear. Yes, we want to be part of the solution, but the West has got to take greater responsibility. And if the West not going to take greater responsibility, we're not going to move on these areas. And find just a quick reference to one example of incompetence. And this is the non-proliferation regime. And here it's a great tragedy that this non-proliferation regime, which has essentially worked, you know. Essentially, the nightmare scenario we faced was that we would go from 5 nuclear powers to 20 to 25 nuclear powers. That didn't happen. We've gone from 5 to essentially to 8. 5 plus India, Pakistan, Israel. Now it's more or less worked. It's a good regime. It's one that we should be trying to strengthen and sustain. Instead, today the Non-Proliferation Treaty is legally alive, but spiritually dead or dying. And why is it spiritually dead or dying? Well, the nuclear weapon states which took on their obligations under the NPT to reduce their nuclear arsenals, not modernize their nuclear arsenals, have not kept to their promise, have not fulfilled their part of the bargain. So if the nuclear weapon states don't fulfill their part of the bargain, why should the other states now fulfill their part of the bargain? And this basically means that we enter possibly a more dangerous world if you allow the non-proliferation regime to collapse, and it's the West that is responsible for the deterioration of the non-proliferation regime. And I can go into that a bit more. You know, when you have someone like Donald Rumsfeld saying, what's wrong with nuclear bunker busters? You're basically saying, hey, it's okay to cross the nuclear threshold. So if it's okay for you to cross the nuclear threshold, why is it not okay for me to do so? What's so special about you? This is the danger of these comments. And here, if I may say something even more sensitive, I mean, when you have a presidential candidate like Hillary Clinton saying that she will obliterate Iran if Iran attacks Israel, right? I mean, certainly I think America should defend Israel against Iran. I accept that. I think America should do that. But to use the word obliterate an entire country, you know, the message it sends is a very powerful one. What the Muslim world hears, here we go again. Muslim lives don't matter. You can talk freely about obliterating an entire Islamic country. Now, what kind of message are you sending? I thought we were supposed to keep our nuclear weapons locked up and not use them. That's part of the NPT deal. So language and what you use is also very, very important. Then the fact that such statements can be made show you what the reaction the rest of the world can be. But let me conclude now by saying that while I believe that there's a lot that the West needs to do, I believe that we can, at the end of the day, create a better and safer and more predictable world. And the reason why we can do that now is that all the rising new powers from Asia essentially buy into the idea of saying, okay, we are prepared to work on the 1945 rules-based order. We believe in the principles of global trade liberalization. We believe in the principles of cooperation. We believe in the principles of having common rules for everybody. We buy all that. But we now want to be part of the process. We want to join you at the table in working out the new rules, in formulating the new rules and then applying them globally. We want to be there where the decisions are being made. And therefore, you've got to change a lot of international and other processes and other organizations. I mean, let me end with an obvious example, which is that every year, you know, if you look at the world media, every year the G8 leaders meet, and there's a huge media splash. Everyone talks about this new G8 initiative, I mean, every few years the G8 is trying to remove poverty in Africa. And guess what? Poverty in Africa never gets reduced, while you always have G8 declaration after G8 declaration. That's an example of a process that's gone on autopilot, that it has no contact with the real world whatsoever. But it goes on. Now that sort of thing has got to be changed. You need obviously to replace the G8 with a new sets of groupings where you bring in all the rising powers, and if you do so, then I think you can create a better world order. So on that note, may I?
Kishore, thank you very much. That's exactly what I hope for. We've got a few minutes for questions before I want to give Kishore some time to sign books for those of you who'd like to get them. But this was wonderful. I'm going to open with one question, and then we'll work around the room as quickly as we can. You sort of address the management problems, particularly in the government level in the United States. But one of the realities in the world is America. Ken Rogoff wrote an interesting piece a few years ago, which was very prescient. It was called The Debtor's Empire. And his point was that the United States simply couldn't going down the path that it was going and then maintain particularly the structural economic dependencies it was developing. At what point, you're sitting right next to China, you've been negotiating sovereign wealth fund agreements with Bob Kimmett and others from Singapore, not you yourself, unless you've had something to do with them. But to some degree, what do you think happens if America's management mishaps continue? What do you think the world will do to try and kick America back into shape or to get it onto a different course?
Well, let me begin with the good news first. Huh? The good news is that the rest of the world still wants to work with America. And I think that's a very important point to emphasize. I mean, most people believe that despite all his mistakes, despite all his flaws, we can work with America. I mean, many of them try to work with America. What exactly the rest of the world will do if the U.S. continues to be incompetent in its management of various global challenges is that essentially we each will find their own way. And you will begin to find that they will do things among themselves without necessarily involving America. And you see, to some extent, you are seeing this happening already in East Asia. There are various processes going on whereby, because the Asians need to have a certain degree of order and predictability in their own environment. And since America's attention is so intermittent, right? Say, okay, we will carry on. We will do it in the hope that eventually, by the way, that America would join in and become part of the solution. But they're not going to wait for America and say, no, we'll do nothing until America comes along.
Great, thank you. Alan Wolf. It's good to see you, Alan.
There are many questions one could ask because this is a very stimulating discussion. One I would ask is, if you say there are new models to follow for the Middle East in particular, other than the United States or Western Europe, what would you look to as a new model? Would you look to, from the Middle East, would you look to what in China, what in India, or if you say BRIC, Russia, Brazil, why would those be particularly good models? Every country has its pluses and minuses, but what are the aspects that would be particularly compelling for a Middle Eastern country with any of those models?
Yeah, I think the most the most important part of it, the model they're looking for is they want to transform their societies, right? That's essentially what they want to do. They want to have a society with some of them have very high per capita incomes if you have oil well. Many of them don't. But you want to have a thriving economy. You want to have jobs for your people. You want to provide education for the vast majority of people. You want to be engaged with the rest of the world. So you look around and you see which are the ones that are most successful at doing it now. And these are the common variables in what you find among the East Asian success stories. And for example, to answer your question a different way, in most Western analysis of what it takes to succeed, the belief is that the most important variable is democracy, for example. I mean, the lesson they have learned is that the critical variable for development is not democracy, because in East Asia you can see situations where democracies succeed, like India, democracies fail. Philippines maybe is an example. And then communist states succeed like China, communist states fail like North Korea. So the common variable is not democracy or not lack of it. The common variable essentially is good governance with the best practices that I mentioned earlier. I think that's what they're looking to implement. So for example, if you look, take one example, take Dubai for example, right? In its efforts to become a financial center and so on and so forth, the initial model it used was Singapore, right? It said, why is Singapore succeeding? Why can't we do the same? And today, by the way, in many areas, Dubai is ahead of Singapore, But clearly they went there and say, what can we learn from these parts of the world? And if you look at what King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is trying to do in setting up a university of science and technology, that's why does he want a university of science and technology? Because he believes that's what he'll use to transform his society and bring it and modernize it. So the fact that they're thinking along those lines is a very positive development.
This university, I just got back from Saudi Arabia, actually just recruited away the president of Kishore's university to serve as the head of it, and it will be the first fully co-ed university in Saudi Arabia. It's interesting. There's a great book out that I want to recommend. I'm going to come in called Who Speaks for Islam, and it's essentially a major new book that surveys Muslims through the Islamic world, but a lot in the Arab world, and it was done by the Gallup organization. I have a copy of it, and we're going to invite the writers of the book here to address partly that question, but I think you'd be surprised by the answer. But let's, Mike Miyazawa.
Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate you for using the words the return of China, not the rise of China. I'm from Japan, and we know China is our immediate neighbor, and China has always been the superpower in the region. The last century was just an exception during their 4,000 years of history. Okay, my question is this. What do you think is the power or the source of power that could influence or reshape the rest of the world? And do you think Asia has that kind of power?
Well, I think one point I haven't emphasized is that we are in a very, what I call a very plastic moment of world history. You know, everything is changing, and in terms of the ideas that we are going to turn to move forward, I want to emphasize this. Many of the ideas still come from the West. You know, whether it's free market economics, science and technology, education, rule of law. I mean, these are the pillars of Western wisdom I speak about. Many of the ideas are going to come from the West. But what's new, what the one contribution that Asia is going to make, by the way, is that it's going to demonstrate that in many areas it can perform as well as, if not better, than the West. And the most obvious example here again is free market economics. Today you have a remarkable situation, by the way. It's an example of how things are changing. Where in the past, I remember in the 1970s, 1980s, attending UN meetings, G77 meetings, when the West would be preaching, you must open up your economies and you must liberalize. And the third world countries would say, hey, if we open up our economies, we'll be raped by the West. It's bad for us. Today you have this remarkable situation where the greatest believers in free market economics today are China, India, and the other Asian countries. And then you have the populations in America and Europe saying, hey, if we open up our economies, we're going to lose out to China and India. And that's why Lou Dobbs is now got such a big resonance in America. And that's a huge shift, you know, in barely 10 to 15 years, you know. So I think what the Asians will do is, in the first phase, demonstrate how they can implement many of these practices better than others can.
Great. So there are way more of you than I have time for. I'm going to apologize in advance. I want you to spend time with him afterwards, so we'll have time. Unfortunately, we have another event at 5:30, so we're not going to be able to handle it. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Damir Marusik. I'm from the American Interest magazine. You wrote an article for us 2 issues ago about the rise of Chinese smart power, and you contrasted that with Western strategy. One thing that's jumped out at me in the Foreign Affairs article was this notion of Western democracies, their strategy being hijacked by competitive populism. So I'm wondering if you can talk about why you're so optimistic that we can come to terms when it seems like strategy is being set, especially you see the elections today in the United States, that there's all this talk about very easy solutions, appeals to populism. Where will Western wise men come to cede power to a rising East, I guess?
I guess the correct answer is that the wise men will come from the New America Foundation, right?
Exactly. It's never about peace, always about equilibrium.
Let me emphasize one point. I don't underestimate what America and other Western countries can do. I think it is still amazing that the world's best universities are still very much in the West, and the world's most highly educated populations are still in the West, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done. But the problem that the West has had is that the West has grown insular and arrogant. It's begun to be, the West has reached a position where it cannot conceive of the possibility that it is part of the problem, cannot conceive part of the possibility that it may be failing in some critical areas. So first you need to go through a very painful process of mindset change. And essentially, if you want to know why Asians have turned around, is that the Asians have asked fundamental questions like, how did we lose 200 years? What did we do wrong? Right? So you get a much more fundamental kind of thinking taking place in Asia than you do in the West. In the West, there's an assumption that no matter what happens, the Western states will do well. That's no longer the case. You have to adapt, you have to change, you have to compete, and you've got to get rid of the common agricultural policy, you've got to get rid of your subsidies and so on and so forth. But these are painful adjustments which in a sense many of the Asian states have made themselves and decided to make. And what most people have not noticed is the unilateral trade liberalization of many Asian countries. Many Asian countries have reduced their tariffs way ahead of the WTO commitments. Why? Because they believe they're going to succeed. So this is what the West needs to do also.
You're going to go fast.
One of the changes that may result from climate change is an increased accessibility of the Russian heartland. You've talked about Asia, but Eastern Russia is the one Asian country that you've left out of your discussion. What do you think might Russia's role be?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I have not discussed Russia at all in my book. And it was a very deliberate decision on my part, because I cannot figure out what is happening in Russia. See, logically, if you go on pure geopolitical analysis, the rise of China, and it's real, okay, Reuther of China, rise of China, is it going to create, the main country that should be worried about it initially is Russia. I mean, Russia has got the world's largest uninhabited territory next to the fastest growing, most populous nation. So logically, I should be in Russia, Moscow today worrying about China. But guess what? Putin spends most of his time attacking the United States, attacking Western Europe, and obviously, and I can understand some of that anger, because in the 1990s, essentially the Russians feel they were sold a bill of goods by the United States when they were asked to become democratic overnight. What happened? The economy imploded, they had a GNP smaller than Belgium's, the infant mortality rates went up, life expectancy went down, and the West said, hey, well done Russia, you're democratic, wonderful, wonderful. And I've never seen people as bitter. When you talk to the Russians in private, they are so bitter. And that bitterness towards the West, which I think is temporary, which I think will fade away, but that's got to play itself out first. And, you know, the European Union obviously is not managing Russia very well either. So that's also part of the problem. So until the US, until Russia stabilizes its relations with the West, then after that, then I think you'll have a sense of which way it'll go. I have, at the end of the day, a positive win situation where all the rising economic powers can grow together, by the way. You know, it is not a zero-sum game. So Russia can join it too.
Good, great. I'm going to take, I apologize to the last question here, and then we'll do intimate book signing discussion. Go ahead.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Rob Colorina, Ambassador, your comments on China and India regarding it being a blame for food prices and also energy, understand, but you stopped short of commenting on recommendations that, in fact, Asia and companies from these regions can, in fact, embark on communications campaigns or just some sort of spin, because it's sort of self-fulfilling. You have frustrated companies, you have frustrated politicians, but then more so the voters are going to be even more frustrated whichever way it goes. And I would venture to say we haven't seen the worst yet as far as prices. Is this something that the Asian companies or the political leaders should adopt a little bit more of a message campaign?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think unfortunately there is still an Asian tendency, which you all know. I mean, Asians don't like to be frank and blunt in public. In that sense, I'm not Asian, you know.
I never doubted that.
So, and most Asians always want to tell you what they think you want to hear. I mean, even though it's the Japanese who have the tradition of hone and tatame. Hone is what they really think. Tatame is what they tell you what you think you want to hear. Asians, all kinds of Asians have it. And for other reasons, China, for example, wants to take a very low geopolitical profile because it doesn't want to upset America and be seen to challenging American leadership. So for a variety of reasons, you find that most Asians will not speak out. And that, in a sense, is also part of the reason why I wrote the book that I did, because if you look at my website, www.mahbubani.net, it's amazing. You read the Western reviews of my book, many of them are negative. The Economist says it's an anti-Western polemic, don't read it. The Financial Times said this is another anti-Western book by Kishore Mahbubani. And you read the Asian reviews, they're all overwhelmingly, strongly enthusiastic, saying, finally, somebody is saying what we Asians want to say. So I think if you read my book, you get a sense of what they're thinking.
Well, Kishore, I am reading your. I apologize, Victor. We've got to close now. But I am in the middle of your book. I'm enjoying it, and I find, I guess what I wanted it is. I also find a lack of candor in Washington, just generally about how to get things back in the right course. In addition to the excellent foreign affairs piece that Kishore has, there is another debate with Fareed Zakaria, who largely makes that point, that we're screwing up things now, but there's a chance to get things right. And then you've got Richard Haas in the same issue arguing that he's sort of with you, that the American era, the Western era is over, and you're going to have largely a competition of other nodes, sort of along the lines that Parag Khanna, who's here at the New America Foundation, has written in his book Second World. So I actually, if you go to a blog which I'm close to called The Washington Note, I actually call Kishore Mahbubani the godfather, if you will, of those who see the time of the West passing somewhat, and I elevate John Eikenberry somewhat. I should have picked maybe my friend Martin Walker or others to sort of represent the school of others that still look at American power as being so substantial in the world and is fundamentally driving most global behavior for all the other countries. And we're going to try and tee up an interesting discussion and debate, which John Eikenberry has already accepted from his while he's traveling to London. So we'll have this go back and forth. And for those of you viewing on the web, we'll look forward to your comments. But I highly recommend taking a look at Kishore Mahbubani's very thought-provoking and important book. So thank you very much for being here. Please extend him a round of applause. Thank you.
So you're going to go inside?